The year was 1415. Europe was ablaze with conflict. England and France had been locked in the brutal Hundred Years' War, a struggle not just for land, but for honor, legacy, and survival. King Henry V of England, young yet unyielding, had claimed the French throne through bloodline and right. But France mocked his claim. To prove his might, Henry marched across the French countryside, determined to carve his destiny into the annals of history. His army, however, was not the grand force one might imagine. Barely 6,000 weary men, many sick and starving, trudged through mud and rain. Among them were the pride of England. Thousands of longbowmen, men hardened not by armor, but by discipline, strength, and unshakable will. France, on the other hand, assembled a storm. Nearly 20,000 armored knights and men-at-arms, glistening in steel, mounted on horses that thundered like rolling storms. The odds were laughable. To many, England was already defeated. And yet, history remembers Agincourt not as France's triumph, but as England's miracle. As the English trudged into a narrow, muddy field near the village of Agincourt on the morning of October 25th, 1415, St. Crispin's Day, they knew this was where destiny would test them. The night before, Henry had walked among his men. There were no golden speeches, no royal distance. He was with them, sharing their hunger, their fatigue, their fear. To his soldiers, he was not just a king, but a brother in arms. And when the dawn broke, mist curling over the fields, the sight that awaited them was terrifying. Across the field, stretching endlessly, stood the French, gleaming armor, fluttering banners, and the confidence of overwhelming numbers. The English dug in. Stakes were driven into the ground, angled to pierce charging horses. Archers prepared their bows, 6 feet of yew wood, strung tight, capable of piercing steel at 200 yards. The men-at-arms, though few, tightened their ranks, shields ready. Then silence fell. The kind of silence that comes before a storm. And from the English lines, a cry rose, steady and defiant. Drums beat, arrows were knocked. The archers drew their strings back until wood creaked under strain. Their king gave the signal, and in that moment, as thousands of arrows darkened the sky like a swarm of locusts, history began to turn. The first storm of arrows screamed through the sky, a black cloud of death descending upon the French. The shafts fell with merciless precision, piercing armor gaps, striking horses, shattering shields. Chaos erupted instantly. The mighty French cavalry, meant to crush the English line in a single charge, stumbled before it even began. Horses shrieked, armored knights fell into the mud, their once proud charge broken by a rain of wood and iron. The French commanders urged them forward, wave after wave. Yet the English longbowmen fired relentlessly, each man loosing 10 to 12 arrows per minute. Within moments, tens of thousands of arrows had turned the battlefield into a nightmare of steel and screams. Still, the French pressed on. Their sheer numbers pushed them across the narrow field. But the mud betrayed them. Days of autumn rain had transformed Agincourt's earth into a swamp. Heavily armored knights sank knee-deep, struggling like drowning men. Horses collapsed under their own weight, trapping riders beneath. From behind their wooden stakes, the English archers now drew shorter, deadlier shots. Arrows meant not to arc from the sky, but to pierce throats, visors, and unarmored joints. Men fell in heaps, crushed by their comrades behind them. King Henry watched from the center. His face was calm, his will unbroken. He knew this was not just a fight. It was survival. England had no room for defeat. To fall here meant the death of his campaign, and perhaps his crown itself. By midday, the French front lines had collapsed into chaos. Their noble knights, trapped in mud, were slaughtered like prey. Yet the battle was far from over. The French still had reserves, men-at-arms ready to storm the field. If they reached the English archers, the fragile line would shatter. Henry knew this. His men knew this. The air was thick with sweat, blood, and mud, but no English soldier broke. Instead, a strange unity bound them. Archers, knights, and even the weakest infantry stood shoulder to shoulder. In that desperate hour, they were not merely soldiers, they were brothers defending their very lives. And somewhere, amidst the cries of war, Henry's words from the morning echoed, "He today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother." The English were outnumbered, exhausted, and starving, but they were no longer afraid. At this turning point, as the French sent their second wave into the field, history was about to witness one of the greatest underdog victories ever recorded. You have been watching Timeline Dresser, the place where history breathes again, where stories of courage, sacrifice, and destiny come alive. If this journey touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, because many more tales of the past are waiting to be told. The second French assault poured forward, desperate to crush the English line. Knights forced their way through the mud, their visors gleaming, their war cries echoing across the broken field. Behind them, thousands more pressed forward, a wall of steel and desperation. The English archers had spent countless arrows. Many now dropped their bows, grabbed axes, swords, and daggers, and leapt into the fray. Mud clung to their boots, but their spirit burned brighter than ever. These were not noblemen in gilded armor. These were common men, farmers and peasants turned soldiers. And yet, in the mire of Agincourt, they fought like lions. The French advance faltered again. Packed tightly in the narrow field, they had no room to maneuver. One knight slipped, another fell on top of him, and soon dozens lay trapped, crushed beneath the weight of their own comrades. The English seized the moment, hacking and thrusting at any exposed flesh, turning the field into a slaughterhouse. At the center of the storm rode King Henry V himself. Unlike many kings who commanded from the safety of the rear, Henry was in the thick of the fight. His crown had been replaced with a simple helmet, his sword stained with mud and blood. Witnesses would later swear that he fought like one of his own men, striking down foes, rallying his soldiers, and proving that leadership was not about birthright, but about courage. At one moment, a French knight nearly struck Henry down. The king's helmet was dented, his face bloodied, but he rose again, sword flashing. His men roared at the sight, and their courage flared anew. Still, the battle dragged on. For every French knight that fell, more pressed forward. The English line wavered but did not break. Time seemed endless. Mud, blood, and steel mixing into one unholy nightmare. Then came the turning tide. The French, suffocating in their own armor, were exhausted. They could barely lift their swords. The English, though worn and bloodied, still stood with grim determination. Slowly, the French began to collapse, not in a retreat, but in a drowning, suffocating mass. The battlefield became a graveyard. French nobility, the pride of France, lay dead or dying in the muck. The English, against all odds, had not only survived, they had shattered an enemy 3 times their size. By late afternoon, the cries of battle had faded into silence. Crows circled overhead. The ground was so thick with corpses that survivors could walk from one side of the field to the other without touching earth. Against all odds, against all reason, the English had triumphed. Agincourt was not just a battle won, it was a miracle carved in blood and courage, and at its heart stood Henry V, not only as a king, but as a leader who fought shoulder to shoulder with his men, proving that destiny favors the bold. When the mud had settled and the silence of dusk descended upon Agincourt, the true weight of what had happened began to sink in. The French army, once proud, once unstoppable, was shattered. Thousands of their finest knights, nobles, and lords lay dead upon the field. Entire generations of aristocratic bloodlines had been cut down in a single day. The flower of French chivalry was gone, buried in mud and silence. The English, though victorious, were not without scars. Their numbers had been small to begin with, and now even fewer remained. Exhausted, caked in mud and blood, they stood among the fallen with hollow eyes. Victory did not feel like triumph. It felt like survival. And yet, this survival had rewritten history. King Henry IV, the young monarch who had marched into France against impossible odds, had not only endured, he had carved his name into legend. It is said that in the fading light of that October day, Henry walked across the field, not with the arrogance of a conqueror, but with the solemnity of a man who had seen death too closely. He gave thanks not for his crown, but for the courage of his men, the archers, the infantry, the ordinary souls who had turned the tide of history with nothing but grit and determination. In the years that followed, Agincourt became a symbol, a tale of how a small, starving army, armed with little more than bows and belief, had brought a mighty nation to its knees. It was a victory that would echo across Europe, whispered in taverns, sung in ballads, and immortalized in Shakespeare's words. But beyond the myth, Agincourt was real. It was mud and blood, fear and courage, death and survival. It was proof that history is not always written by the strongest, but by the bravest. And perhaps that is why, 6 centuries later, the Battle of Agincourt still stirs the human heart. Because it reminds us that even when the odds are impossible, when defeat seems certain, courage and unity can change destiny itself.